Hey everybody, welcome to the episode of Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Chris Shang, and today we have Amanda Slavin, who is the founder and CEO of Learning Frequency. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, happy Friday to you. Tell us a little bit about Learning Frequency and what it is you guys do.
Learning Frequency is a platform that's focused on really the principle of metacognition, which is that it increases student progress by 7 months, which is the act of students actually understanding the way that they think. Students take a questionnaire based on 10 plus years of my entire life, which is based on my engagement methodology, with the way that they like to learn, and it visualizes their answers into an avatar that they then own as an NFT on the blockchain. So they actually own their data and the visual representation of that data. They then get personal strategies that are automated based on the way that they like to learn so that they can reflect on that and then add strategies for themselves. And then this plugs into lots of different learning environments from a personalization layer, whether that be a traditional classroom or even a video game, which is the work that we're doing with some awesome partners like Roblox and Sandbox, being able to kind of think about change the way that we think about learning.
Interesting. I have a lot of questions around that. Before
Yeah,
we
me
dive into
too.
the nitty-gritty of all of it, let's talk about your background. Because I mean, I've gone through it. Your LinkedIn reads like autobiography to a certain degree. But you started off doing a lot of marketing, advertising, content production, managing live events, things like that, including for TEDx, and then also speaking at TEDx. But walk us through what that former chapter of your career looked like, in terms of just level of interest. Like, how did you figure out that was the avenue you wanted to get into, from a young age? And then, or maybe you just, jumped into it or discovered it through some random path, which I think a lot of marketing people do. But walk us through what that looked like.
Yeah, I definitely a random path. And I think also just being very open to serendipity. That's been my entire life. But I have a master's in curriculum and instruction. I was a teacher and I wrote my thesis on something called the 7 levels of engagement. And a friend of mine actually called me an engagement monster, almost like a Sesame Street character, because the through line in my entire life are these 7 levels of engagement. It's the only through line. So after I ended up graduating with a master's in education during the recession, I ended up opening restaurants all over America. I had
Oh,
no experience other than education and these 7 levels of engagement. So I turned that into a marketing funnel. And then I ended up producing a conference called Summit Series. So I took some days off of my hospitality job and produced Summit Series because my boyfriend from college's fraternity brother was the director of operations. And I went there and I ended up meeting my former business partner. His name was Tony Shea. And so I actually started an agency with him and really focused on using these levels of engagement to disrupt the status quo of how we think about engagement, whether it's our external customers or our internal customers, our employees, and did that for a really long time. And that had a lot of different types of paths because, again, I was living in downtown Vegas. I was at this really interesting point of time with Tony where he spent $350 million to revitalize downtown Vegas. And then I ended up writing a book based on that thesis. I was on the advisory board of HubSpot, so we turned it into a curriculum, gave it to a bunch of professors, got back into education. And that's where my then ended up doing a lot of other things, but I guess we could discuss that. You said how did I get there and what interested me? I would say that what interested me and has always interested me is people. I'm very curious about people's stories, and I'm very deeply passionate about collaborating, community building, whether that's with kids or whether it's with grown-ups. But back in the day, there just weren't a lot of options. Back in the day, back in my day, right? If you liked people, it was you could be an event planner, you could be an educator, you could be, it wasn't like anyone could be an entrepreneur and create anything. And so Summit opened my eyes up to what was possible. And then I could create my own experiences, companies, initiatives. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
super cool. Uh, you mentioned this seven levels of
Seven
engagement.
levels. Yeah.
I'm curious as to what that is, because if that's your through line and it's led you to a lot of these different, I mean, I would say like, s- super relevant projects, companies, people, these aren't small things that we're talking about. So what was that? How did you come up with the thesis for that idea for the
Mhm.
thesis? Obviously you mentioned just about people, but like, where does that come from? Because I think like, things like empathy and compassion, I think it can be, you can help people realize those things. And I think those are like the building blocks of relationships. But also I think there's those that just innately are in tune with that,
Mhm.
and that it becomes a driving force in their purpose.
Mhm.
I don't know if that resonates with you, but I'm curious
Yeah.
as to, it's just such an interesting like path, right? Where
Mhm.
that becomes the thing that, because very rarely I feel like people that young will know what the path is, or or have something that is the through line in their life from
Yes.
their 20s. You know what I'm saying? It's like
Yes.
you're lucky if you get to there in your late 20s, but like 30s, I feel is like usually when you forge it out. And it seems like you did it at a much earlier age. So I'm curious as to how that came about.
Yeah. I mean, my mom tells me these stories of myself when I was 3, I would line up all my stuffed animals on the stairs and create a party for them every day and sing Party for Friends, a song I made up. And then when I was 6, I would bring the entire class together at the cafeteria table and actually exchange snack, like facilitate snack exchange. Like you should give them this and you should give them that. So this is like really, really in
Yeah.
me. Like I have always been someone, I think actually to a fault that has been very, very committed and passionate about inclusion and making sure everyone is a participant in the experience. And when you're young, that ends up actually panning out as successful at people means popular. And that was something that I was very, very committed to when I was in high school. And I was on the phone. I mean, one of those cord phones. I would press flash and I would be lying on my floor. No one even knows what that means for young people listening to this, but we did not have cell phones. And I'd be on my phone for 6.5 hours a night. And I wasn't really, I was getting B's in school. I didn't really care about schoolwork and I cared about being popular. And then I actually ended up moving multiple times in high school, which completely shifted my perspective of my sense of self because I
Mm,
wasn't popular anymore and I didn't really have. And so I kind of had to find my own way and really figure out what worked and didn't work for me. And it opened up a lot. There was a lot more there, but we only have 30 minutes. That's probably a whole other conversation. But so I always had that point of being a connector, of wanting to be with people, but I didn't know what that meant for, and I loved kids. That was like my real passion. When I went to be a teacher, I realized that because I loved kids so much, I didn't actually want to be a teacher because it would a lot of teaching is not actually being able to spend time
yeah.
with kids. It's curriculum development. It's placating the board. It's placating the, to adults, and it's being in a box. And that was just the opposite of my personality. And so I left, thinking again, what could I be doing? And it really wasn't something like I'm like, this is the through line through my life. It just was like the thing I had available to me because when I went into hospitality and nightlife and I was opening these restaurants that were really, I mean, it was all the responsibility was given to me. It was a recession. I was paid pretty much nothing. And they were like, you're the director of marketing events. You're going to be doing a place in the Hamptons. You're going to be doing a bar in Murray Hill. And you're going to be opening a place in Chelsea. And all of the marketing, all of the events comes to you. And you have to have an event every single day that you book. And you have to produce all the events. And you have to do all the social media marketing. And you have to do all of the traditional marketing. And I was just a 23-year-old. And I was like,
Mm,
I don't know what to do. But then I was like, but I do know about these levels of engagement that I found in this textbook that these
mm,
two professors wrote about, in 2001 that I used to understand. And I'm like, it must be similar because people are people. And so I just started to think about it as kind of my secret sauce. And that is what I've always done without even realizing. And then I just realized an agency is kind of doing everything for everyone. And that's the opposite of what I believe in as a teacher. And so then I put it in the forefront and said, rather than me having to do this for you, I want to teach you how to use this yourself. And that's when my life really shifted and it started to become really guiding me versus just kind of being in the background.
yeah. It's so interesting. It's almost like the ignorance or the naivete of like being a 23-year-old with all this responsibility shouldered on you. You know, you could have gone two ways though, right? I feel like at
Huh.
23, there's those that just crack and that is it. And they just wave the white flag. Yeah, okay.
Well, I did for actually great point that I normally don't ever talk about. I don't think I ever even talked about it publicly, which is that when I first started,
Yeah,
so it was like a fire hose. I had no mentorship, I had no guidance, and I was doing everything. And they didn't even really know. And I kept making these mistakes. And so actually what ended up happening was 3 weeks into it, I got into a car accident because I was rushing to work and I couldn't stop and I had no time off. And I was literally going 7 days a week, going driving today. It was complete madness. And I just didn't come to work one day. And one of the manager called and said, you can't, because I was answering the phones. There was no interns. I was answering the phones. I was doing all the reservations. I was doing all the marketing. I was doing all the, no one knew how much work I was doing. The person kind of right above me was seen as doing all the work, but it was
yeah,
really me. They didn't know. And I said, you can't, I was like, I can't do this. Like, and I said, I've literally never said this in public because I was the only woman. And I said to him, you guys treat me differently because I'm a woman and I can't just shoulder all of this responsibility and I'm not taken seriously and I'm not given mentorship. And they had had 9 women in that position in
mm,
2 years that they had let go. And so in that moment, he said, I don't know why you're saying this specifically, but you cannot just not show up for work. And now you need to have a conversation with your boss. So the next day I got in and it was, there was not many people in the group and it was me, my boss and this manager. And I looked at him and I said, I deeply care about this company. And if you don't want me to take this company into the ground because I'm going to make significant mistakes, you're trusting me with all of this responsibility, but you're giving me absolutely no guidance or mentorship, then it's not really going to work in your favor. If you want me to be successful, these are the things that I need. And it was just one of those moments for me where I was like, I can't let these people down. But in order to do my job, they have to give me more. So I did almost crack, actually, very much so. And then I almost cracked again when I was 26 and had a complete, quarter life crisis. There's been many, many breakdowns, breakthroughs, but I've
Yes.
done the work. I constantly see it. I'm going to say one more thing and then I want you, but I just was on a phone call a few days ago and someone said to me, what do you think life is for? And I said, what an amazing question, because that allows for us to really think about that we all see life differently. And two people that see life differently could see the same circumstance very differently from each other. Like if you think you're a victim. And for me, I've always seen things as I'm a learner. And so if I see something like that, I'm like, what do I need to learn from this? How do I need to move forward? What's the work that I need to do? And that's how I've operated in order to be able to thrive versus just kind of getting taken down by the things that happen.
Yeah. I can't agree more. I mean, I think a lot of it's perspective. I think,
Mm.
I used to think that there are people out there have gone through insufferable things, and maybe I could understand why they're playing, why they have the victim mentality. But then you also see people who go through insufferable things and then not play into that mentality, or
It's
even
real.
much worse. And now, instead of feeling bad for those people, I think it's, it is a choice. There's a certain amount of things
Mm.
that you can endure in life that at some point it's a choice.
Yeah, that's probably also where it came from for me, is that that's actually a really good point that I never thought about, because I know so many people and I ask so many questions and I am very, very curious about people's stories. Rather than being kind of stuck in my own story or even in my own town or in my own, small mentality. This is really before social media too, right? I knew so many different types of people with so many different types of backgrounds and so many different experiences that I was able to pull from all these different experiences and see examples of what I wanted for myself. And so I would be able to, even if I heard, from my family or from people that were close to me, the victim mentality, I was like, there are people going through so many more extreme things, and the way that they're responding is so different from this. And so I get to choose. And I
Yeah.
think that was the big opening for me over and over and over again when things have happened. I was diagnosed out of nowhere with type 1 diabetes when I was 30.
Wow.
It was a really, really hard experience for me that's transformed my whole life. And I actually have had two really high risk pregnancies since then, because it's a very high risk
Yeah.
pregnancy, it's type 1 diabetes. And it's been really hard, it's been really challenging, but it's one of those things that I had to look at, and I had to say, like, what is the lesson here? And for me, it was actually slowing me down enough. I'm very fast. I move very quickly. I do a lot. As you can see with my LinkedIn, I also, invest and advise and 30 something. Like I have a lot of capacity. But I think it slowed me down enough to have kids. I don't think my body, my physical, my mental would have actually been healthy enough to have children. So you never know. You never know what the lesson is.
Mm, I love that. Interesting. You mentioned a few things already that I feel like, we go through life, and it's like these things that it's only in hindsight, I feel like we get these like paths that we have to choose
Mm.
at different points. And it does sometimes those decisions don't, they feel like so minuscule, or like it's not even a big thing, right? And then it's like, or just it's just though it's built into your personality, and you just go down that certain choice of a path because that's who you are. And then you realize, like, 5, 10 years later, like, oh shit, that's why that happened, or like that's why I met that person, or this is
Yes.
why this happened, and it sucked really bad, right?
Yes.
But I love that perspective of just like, you know being
Mm.
somebody that just kind of like weathers a storm and just knows that at some point it's gonna stop raining. Like that's just, and then being exposed to enough people to realize that is almost like a universal truth. Because I think that's the key, is
Mm.
that you have to be able to be willing to put yourself in a situation to be exposed to others that's such a wider, range of humanity than what
Yes.
you are so used to. And I think that's something that I got goosebumps when you were talking about it, because I think that that's something I just took away from this conversation, is like a learning, is that you have to be willing to put yourself in all these different types of
That's
uncomfortable
right.
conversations, relationships, friendships,
That's
mentors,
right.
mentees so that you have that perspective of like, oh, there's so many ways to look at this.
And that's, I mean, and when my thesis was actually using the community as the classroom and the impact on engagement and achievement. And it actually was, I was really inspired. I've always wanted to travel. My family is not travelers. They don't, that's not their thing. I've just always, my best friend since I was 8 years old, I actually am a co-founder in his business called Runway Health. It's a travel health company. He came in for show and tell and brought something back from the Amazon. They went to a family trip from the Amazon. And my mom tells me the story that when I came home and I was like, I want to do that. I want to go like Josh. Like he was kind of one of those early inspirations for me where I was like, I want to travel all over the world. My mom was like, why? I'm like, I just know I do. So when I was 20, even though I didn't have the money, didn't have the means, didn't have, I figured out how to study abroad in London, and my school didn't have a program there. And so rather than actually the school having like a university partner, the program was in the city. So the art history classes and all the museums and the Shakespeare classes at the Globe. And it was just such an incredible experience for me that opened me up to so much. And I, you know, I took like Ryanair flights and went different places every single weekend. And I think traveling has always been that thing for me of just like unlocking, but also some of the biggest lessons that I've ever had have been from cab drivers and Uber drivers, truly.
Yeah,
Like a
yeah,
cab driver in New York. I went to India, had a groundbreaking, really life changing experience with a cab driver in India, which is again for another day. But then I got back and actually I had the most groundbreaking experience with a cab driver in New York City. And I wasn't on my phone and I was talking and I was, you just never know where connection's going to come from. And I will say, talk about vulnerability and you know, kind of being shameless. I write about this in my book, and Tony and I would always laugh about it. But I went to downtown Vegas and he didn't remember inviting me out there. And then I went to go hug him to like say hello and he backed away from me and he was like, who are you? And so I was like, okay, I got to keep going. Like, I can't take this personally, but that could have bruised my ego. I think you just can't take yourself that seriously.
yeah,
And if you like think that it's, and the less you, and if you think that billionaires and busboys have the same value, which they do, because busboys gave me that entire job in hospitality, then and you really again never know who's going to teach you the lessons or what kind of relationship's going to come from the people that you're connecting with and communicating with, then life is really exciting even when it's scary and hard.
yeah, absolutely. Um, so cool. Yeah, I feel like all that stuff is so is so aligned to me personally. Like I'm in this process of getting rid of 95% of my possessions and just going for spend the next year like living abroad and like on an Airbnb adventure in different countries.
Yep, we did that. We've lived in 20 something places with my son post COVID and then now with my daughter.
That's
It's
awesome. And I think that's such a great thing to give your kids because I feel like
yeah.
that's what my parents gave us when one of the best gifts that they gave us was just traveling a lot to international places. And
Hmm.
my dad always wanted to instill upon us like to live like the locals do, so you really understand what their quality and um of life looks like.
Hmm.
Yeah, super
Wow.
interesting.
That's awesome. That's incredible. I mean, that's you know, we've lived all over the world with our kids. We're moving to London with our kids actually in three
Wow.
weeks. And so we just got all of our visas, and it is something that I do feel is extremely important is for them to, you know, especially during COVID, right? One of my son's first things that he learned was mask. Like when he was less than 2 years old and he kept going like this, mask. And so, you know, it's such a bizarre thing, first of all, to be told over and over again that you're not safe, and
Yeah,
second of all to not be able to, again, that relationship of serendipity and connection. And so I remember during COVID, Clubhouse had just started,
yeah,
and I was breastfeeding and I was miserable and I was living with my parents, and it was such a hard experience. I remember it was just like I was in a really, it was a really really hard time. And Clubhouse had just began and all of my friends that I had known through all these networks and community were on Clubhouse. I was like, what is this thing? And I would just get on while I was like pumping or feeding or walking or just do, and I would have that serendipity again. And it was small enough where it was still really special and unique. And so when you have, you know, even in these moments where you feel like, okay, you need to be able to reach out. You need to kind of force that connection because that's what makes us human is that community and that connection and that collaboration. And when you don't have it, it's much harder to go through the hard moments of life.
yeah, that's for sure. um which I feel like is a good segue into some of the things that you're working on right now, uh, which is about, you said, more empowering those seven levels of engagement versus, utilizing it for your own self gain.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like for you across some of these? You have a few different platforms to do that in, but what does that look like? What is your And how are you approaching this a little bit differently, especially now from that kind of a perspective of like trying to empower others with it, and because I think like, and I'll just take one step back, but I think like the thing is, a lot of times now that this has been your through line, this is you kind of know the philosophies of it inside and out. It's not really about execution, or it's not even just about telling people the steps. What I find when you get into like leadership is it's the psychology of how you help people buy into something,
Mhm.
and the way that you communicate it, because every individual that you're going to interact with has a different type of communication skill, right? And so the way
Exactly.
that you can tell the exact same story, the exact same 10 steps, or the exact same 7 fundamentals, but the way that somebody digests it or interprets it or opens their mind enough to buy
Hmm.
into it is so different. So we'll
I
love to
mean, literally, so the 7 levels are nuanced, specific levels of engagement that measure essentially like connection, and level 2 is unsystematic engagement when you're confused by the messaging. So it's exactly what you just said. Everyone has their own kind of way of digesting and their own communication and their own needs and their own interests. And so you need to actually connect with someone from their 7th level, literate thinking, when
Yep.
values and beliefs align, in order for them to buy into anything that you're doing. So I mean, I've always been of the nature, I would want to give away everything for free forever. Like that's just the way that I am. And so when I wrote the book, it was really thinking of it like a textbook. And we created this 60-page curriculum with HubSpot, which is it's analyzing a business. So it's Essence Festival and Coachella just before COVID. And it was actually analyzing the business through the 7 levels of engagement and then leveraging HubSpot tools to increase engagement. So increasing using inbound tools. And so we gave that to 1,400 professors for free. And then Howard University, as I was saying, started teaching it to their MBA students every year. I started guest lecturing at Emerson University, and a bunch of different universities started to really integrate this knowledge and lessons. And that's one very specific, very nuanced understanding of the 7 levels. But then what I realized is that's exactly to exactly your point. That's not for everyone, right? That's for people that need to use HubSpot tools, and that's just one avenue. And the other real avenue that anyone could use and that anyone could benefit from is really thinking about, my whole kind of theory is that we keep treating kids and also even adults like productivity machines, and we keep measuring success based on that metric, which, and now with AI, they will be outpaced and outproduced by machines. So we need to change the way that we think about humans and human skills. And so I then created Catalyst U, which is a learning platform leveraging the 7 levels of engagement. And what that really does is it teaches anyone to think like an entrepreneur. So it's a roadmap for building a business, building a campaign. I always say, like, even also like creating a promote, like, what do you want to accomplish? What are you trying to create in the world? And how can you use these levels as at a very step-by-step process without a lot of the academic terms or that this is level 3, but just like, how do you apply it? And that's the same thing I do with my keynotes. Everything I do is like GIFs. I still never know if it's GIFs or GIFs. It's GIFs, right? Whatever. It's GIFs, it's video, and I break out When Harry Met Sally in the book and in my keynotes. Like everything is accessible and relatable, and it's about relationships. And that is at the end of the day what the 7 levels are about. When it comes to now with education, so with Catalyst U, it's a platform. You can learn about the 7 levels. You could apply it to your business. You could focus on, how to be, and also now you can just upload the roadmap we've designed into ChatGPT and have it answer all your questions, which is crazy. Never thought about that. But with learning frequency, you don't even know that it exists. Learning frequency is for kids. And kids need to understand themselves, but they can't be told that they're like an ENFP, like a Myers-Briggs response, or that they're like a huge paragraph about. They need something that's theirs, and they never get access and ownership to information about themselves. So those levels, just this invisible layer of these questions that we ask kids, and then they get this fun avatar that represents them and represents their data. And so that is, and with that though, there's a bunch of professional development teaching the teachers about the levels of engagement. And so it's again, how are we creating a whole new ecosystem around the learner using the levels through an educational lens? So I can apply these levels to you could literally say to me, here's a problem that I'm facing. And I could say, this is the level and this is what's going on. This is how I could do it. But it's less about that and more about people not settling for lower levels of engagement, people not settling for when, at the table, when people are on their phones and not looking at each other in the eyes, people not settling for when you say, how are you, to a person at a coffee shop and just you don't even wait for them to say what they're saying. I always go to a coffee shop and I'm like, how are you? And they don't even answer. And I'm like, no, how are you? I actually would like to know. And they're so surprised. That's higher levels of engagement. That's what I'm striving for. And so everyone can understand that, and I can make everyone understand it because that's my gift, the engagement monster.
I love it. I know we're up on time, but I just one more question. I think it's such a, I mean, I think it's such a great endeavor. Like, I think, I think like, especially kids at the kid level and trying to help them through this tool, like better understand themselves, but also like better understand like how they can communicate better with other people, how they can engage better with other people, because that at the end of the day will help, I think, a lot of the mental health where they're not feeling so isolated, alone, unique in the pain or whatever the agony that they might be going through. Um, I think like when you look at that mission, um, how has it changed from when you first started it and where it is today and what you
Hmm.
think of in the next like just year or 2 years? Because I think about how fast things are growing and changing and evolving, and especially with like AI
Hmm.
and stuff that where it's in all the meta tools, and I don't know if kids actually know that it is ingrained into there and how they are interacting with it. I don't know what the legal ramifications are for kids under 18 engaging with, AI, and I don't think that's ever been defined, right? But like
Hmm.
that's gonna be, we know that these companies, because we're older and we're around it, but these tech companies are accumulating all these data sets. We don't know how they're gonna use it. Um, and I'm just curious as to how do you think about all of that relating back to what your mission is, and you know, and is the identifier gonna be ultimately like the new the new technology, the greatest technology will be the anti-technology, which is like
Hmm.
the antithesis of that, which is that human to human relationship. And while in the background we have our robots and driverless vehicles, but on the human level, we're still seeking that very rudimentary connection. I don't know if there's any, yeah,
Yeah, so
thoughts.
much. Love that, all of it. I have rolled out learning frequency to thousands of kids all over the world. And what actually I uncovered, which was not something that I initially sought out to do or realized, was not only when they see themselves as like an avatar, so it's like five eyes could mean that they need quiet time, or a pink head could mean that they, need a fidget spinner. It's then when they actually see the rest of the class and they see that each learner is unique. And so then we say, do we all learn the same? And they say no, and we make the invisible visible. And so they start to actually have perspective that they are unique and their needs matter, but they are a part of an environment as well where others have needs. Every time I go to a restaurant with my son, I always say, listen to the music and listen to how loud people are talking. And that's how you can know how loud you could be. You're a part of an environment. You need to respect others in that environment. So I think it's not just self. Going back to the levels of engagement, it's also how do you connect? Yes, first with self, then how do you connect with others? And that's really important. But to also what you said about kind of the humanity of it all, I was talking to a woman today. It's actually two things I'm going to say in response to that, because you talked about data, identity, ownership, as well as then you talked about humanity. I talked to a woman today who's focused on awe and wonder. She's working with longevity experts, and she was saying how people might live to be able to be 500 years old, but they're actually worried that they're going to be bored. So she's
Yeah.
now needing to create strategies and programs to actually make sure that we still have wonder in our lives when we're 500 years old. So that's a whole other level in terms of being able to, again, remember that we're human, what makes us human, and what, yeah, exactly. But on the little bit more of the today or next year or 2 years model, one of my biggest partnerships is with an organization called LearnCard. And LearnCard is a tool. Think of it like a single sign-on solution that's a philanthropic solution that is plugged into every single learning environment, and a child owns their own data through verifiable credentials, through an analytics and dashboard where they are actually seeing the way that they learn, through a personalization layer where it can personalize any learning, but they own their information. So this is something that with my learning frequency profiles and my learning frequency experiences, it's plugged into that. And that is a very, very important thing when our kids are in these blended realities where digital and physical meets and it's in their eyeballs and they can change their faces. I really don't want brands to own their identity. I would really love, even as a marketer, for my own child to own their own information and own their own identity and then know what to do with it. And that's the big thing. How do they understand that these algorithms exist and that they can then be able to utilize their own this own information for their benefit? And that's the problem right now, is it's invisible. And we need to make the invisible visible. We need to teach our kids what to do with data, and we need to teach our kids how to work meaningfully. This is my last thing I'll say. We need to go, the millennials are the last generation in which adults are the because I said so generation, in which we said, okay, yeah, okay, you're right. Now we need to go from gatekeepers of information to guardians of information and teach our kids what to do with this data. So that's my vision for the future.
It's amazing. Well, we'll leave it at that. That was great. So many great pieces of information and nuggets. Really enjoyed the conversation.
You
That was awesome.
too.
So much for taking the time.
Thank you. It's awesome.
Of course.